In the middle of a busy city where skyscrapers touched the clouds and people rushed past each other without a second glance, there was a small courtroom that felt almost forgotten. It wasn't grand or impressive like the buildings outside. The paint on its walls was peeling, and the wooden benches creaked whenever someone shifted their weight. Yet on this particular morning, the room buzzed with energy. People filled every seat, some craning their necks to get a better view, others whispering among themselves about what they thought would happen next. At the center of it all stood two men who couldn't have been more different from each other. One of them was Marcus, a tall man with broad shoulders and a face lined by years of hardship. His short gray hair hinted at his age, but his sharp blue eyes still held a spark of determination. He wore a plain white shirt tucked neatly into slacks, though his hands were calloused, evidence of a life spent working hard. Marcus had served in the military for decades, earning medals and honors for bravery in battles far away. But when he returned home, life didn't turn out the way he'd hoped. Jobs were hard to come by, friends drifted apart, and loneliness became his constant companion. Still, Marcus carried himself with pride, standing straight even when the world seemed determined to push him down. The other man was Eddie, whose appearance made him easy to overlook in a crowd. Thin and wiry, he looked like someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. His dark hair stuck out in tangled clumps, and his clothes, a faded hoodie and patched-up jeans, were frayed and dirty. Eddie lived on the streets, moving from one park bench to another, surviving day by day. Most people avoided looking at him altogether, dismissing him as just another homeless guy. But those who took the time to really see him noticed something special. A quiet strength in his eyes, a resilience that said he hadn't given up, no matter how tough things got. What brought these two unlikely friends together was a story worth telling. Months earlier, Marcus had started taking long walks through the city's largest park. It was his way of clearing his mind, finding peace amidst the chaos of urban life. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he spotted Eddie sitting alone on a bench. At first, Marcus hesitated. He didn't know what to say or if he should even approach. But something about Eddie reminded him of himself, of the nights he'd spent staring at the stars during his time in the service, wondering if anyone cared whether he came back alive. So Marcus walked over and sat beside him. They didn't talk much that first night. Marcus offered Eddie a sandwich he'd packed for his walk, and Eddie accepted it with a nod of thanks. Over time, their meetings became routine. Sometimes Marcus brought food. Other times, they simply sat in silence, watching the world go by. Slowly, a bond formed between them, not based on words, but on understanding. They both knew what it meant to feel invisible, to carry burdens no one else could see, and though they came from completely different worlds, they found comfort in each other's company. But this friendship wasn't just about shared meals and quiet moments. It was about loyalty, too. On the night that led them to the courtroom, Marcus arrived at the park to find Eddie surrounded by 3 security guards. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating Eddie's frightened expression. The guards shouted at him, accusing him of breaking the rules by sleeping in the park after hours. To them, Eddie was nothing more than a nuisance, someone who didn't belong. But to Marcus, he was a friend, and friends don't stand idly by when trouble comes knocking. Without thinking twice, Marcus stepped forward. "Leave him alone," he said firmly, planting himself between Eddie and the guards. His voice carried authority, the kind that comes from years of leadership in high-pressure situations. The guards hesitated, surprised to find someone willing to intervene. When they demanded to know why Marcus was getting involved, he replied simply, "He's my friend." Those 4 words ignited a chain reaction. The guards called the police, and soon enough Marcus found himself facing charges of trespassing. Now here he was, standing in front of a judge, trying to explain why he'd risked so much for someone most people considered unworthy of notice. As the prosecutor laid out the details of the case, painting Marcus's actions as reckless and unnecessary, the tension in the room grew thicker. The judge listened intently, occasionally jotting notes on a pad in front of him. Then, leaning back in his chair, he adjusted his glasses and glanced at Marcus with a raised eyebrow. "Let me get this straight," he said, his tone laced with skepticism. "You're telling me you put yourself in legal jeopardy for him?" He gestured toward Eddie, who sat quietly beside Marcus, avoiding eye contact. A few people in the audience chuckled nervously, unsure whether to take the judge's comment as humor or criticism. Marcus didn't laugh. Instead, he squared his shoulders and looked directly at the judge. In his eyes, there was no trace of regret or doubt. This wasn't just about Eddie, it was about something bigger. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. As Marcus prepared to speak, the courtroom fell silent, everyone waiting to hear what he had to say. Little did they know, his words would change not only the outcome of the case but also the way many of them viewed the world around them. Marcus took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The courtroom was so quiet you could almost hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Everyone leaned forward slightly, waiting for him to speak. Even the judge, who had seemed amused just moments ago, now looked curious. Marcus began slowly, choosing his words carefully. He didn't want to sound angry or defensive. He wanted people to understand. "I've been where Eddie is," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not homeless maybe, but invisible. When I came back from serving my country, no one cared about what I'd seen or done. People clapped at parades and called us heroes, sure, but when it came to actually helping, nothing changed." He paused, glancing around the room. Some faces showed sympathy, others looked skeptical. But Marcus wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking for himself, and for Eddie. He went on to explain how he first met Eddie in the park months earlier. At first it wasn't anything special, just two strangers sharing space on a bench. But over time they started talking more. Marcus learned bits and pieces about Eddie's life, how he'd lost his job after an injury left him unable to work, how his family drifted away as bills piled up, and how he ended up living on the streets. It wasn't laziness or bad choices that brought Eddie here, Marcus explained. It was circumstance. Hard, cruel circumstance. "But here's the thing," Marcus continued, his tone softening. "Eddie isn't defined by where he sleeps at night. He's a person, a good person, someone who still cracks jokes even when life has knocked him down, someone who thanks me every time I bring him food even though he doesn't have to, someone who deserves respect, not ridicule." As Marcus spoke, Eddie shifted uncomfortably in his seat, staring at the floor. He wasn't used to being talked about like this, in front of so many people, no less. The prosecutor frowned, clearly unimpressed. "Respect is earned, Mr. Marcus," he interjected sharply, "and breaking the law doesn't exactly scream role model." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some agreeing with the prosecutor, others shaking their heads. Marcus clenched his jaw but kept his cool. He knew better than to let frustration get the best of him. Instead, he turned back to the judge and continued. "That night in the park," Marcus said, "those guards weren't treating Eddie like a person. They were treating him like trash, like he didn't matter. And I couldn't stand there and watch that happen. Not again." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the weight of memories he rarely shared. Memories of battles fought overseas, of comrades left behind, of coming home to a world that felt colder than he remembered. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The judge tilted his head, studying Marcus closely. There was something genuine in the veteran's demeanor, something raw and honest. Still, the law was the law. "I appreciate your passion, Mr. Marcus," the judge said cautiously. "But laws exist for a reason. Public spaces are meant for everyone, not just those who choose to use them responsibly." Marcus nodded, understanding the point but unwilling to back down. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied respectfully. "But responsibility goes both ways. We can't claim to care about our communities while ignoring the people who need help the most." Those guards didn't give Eddie a chance to explain himself. They didn't see him as human. All they saw was someone sleeping on a bench, and that was enough to make him less than. The tension in the room grew heavier. Some spectators exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to side with Marcus or the judge. Others scribbled notes capturing every word for later discussion. Meanwhile, Eddie sat silently, his fingers twisting nervously in his lap. He hadn't expected all this attention. In fact, part of him wished he could disappear altogether. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. "Look," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly as he gestured toward Eddie. "This man has taught me more about courage than any battlefield ever did. He gets up every morning knowing full well the world might kick him down again, and yet he keeps going. That takes strength. Real strength." He paused, letting the words sink in before adding softly, "If standing between him and those guards makes me a criminal, then fine. I'll take that label. Because sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules." For a long moment, no one spoke. The prosecutor opened his mouth as if to argue, but closed it again, unsure how to respond. The judge rubbed his temples, looking torn between duty and compassion. Finally, he turned to Eddie. "Mr. Eddie," he said, his tone neutral, "do you have anything to say?" Eddie froze, caught off guard by the sudden spotlight. He glanced at Marcus, who gave him a small encouraging nod. Slowly, Eddie stood up, his legs trembling beneath him. He cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper at first. He hesitated, gripping the edge of the witness stand for support. Then, gathering whatever courage he had left, he looked directly at the judge. "I know I don't look like much," Eddie admitted, his voice growing stronger despite the fear in his eyes. "Most days I don't feel like much either. But Marcus sees me. He sees me when no one else does. And yeah, maybe I broke a rule by staying in the park that night. But I wasn't hurting anybody, I was just trying to survive." He swallowed hard, his gaze unwavering. "So, if anyone should be punished, it's me, not him." The courtroom fell silent once more. No one moved. No one breathed. Eddie's words hung in the air, simple, yet powerful. For the first time that day, the focus shifted entirely to him, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person, with thoughts, feelings, and dignity. Even the judge seemed affected, his stern expression softening ever so slightly. As Eddie sat back down, Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The outcome of the case remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. Something profound had shifted in that tiny courtroom. People were beginning to see beyond appearances, beyond stereotypes. And sometimes that's the first step toward real change. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, heavy and thick like a storm cloud hovering just before rain. Everyone seemed frozen in place, their eyes glued to Eddie as he slumped back into his seat beside Marcus. His hands trembled slightly, and he kept his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The weight of what he'd said, and the vulnerability it exposed, was almost too much for him to bear. For years, Eddie had been invisible, ignored by passers-by who saw him as nothing more than a shadow on the sidewalk. But now, every person in that room was looking at him, not with pity or disdain, but with something closer to curiosity. It was unsettling, yet strangely comforting. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk in front of him. He studied Eddie carefully, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he spoke. "Mr. Eddie," he began, his tone softer than before, "you say you weren't hurting anyone, that you were simply trying to survive. Is that correct?" Eddie nodded slowly, then remembered to answer aloud. "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly. His voice wavered, but there was no hesitation in his words. "And Mr. Marcus," the judge continued, turning his attention to the veteran, "you stepped in because you believed those security guards were treating your friend unfairly. You felt compelled to act even knowing the consequences. Is that accurate?" Marcus straightened up, meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied firmly. "I couldn't stand by and let them treat him like he didn't matter, because he does matter." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the tide of the case beginning to shift. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. In his mind, this was a straightforward matter. A man broke the law, Another intervened recklessly, and justice needed to be served. But now, the lines between right and wrong felt blurrier than ever. He cleared his throat and stood up, addressing the judge once more. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clipped, "while I understand the emotional appeal here, we cannot ignore the fact that rules exist for a reason. Allowing individuals to disregard public ordinances sets a dangerous precedent." A few people in the audience murmured in agreement, nodding along with the prosecutor's argument. Others frowned, clearly conflicted. One elderly woman near the back dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, moved by Eddie's testimony. A young man sitting beside her leaned over and whispered, "It's not about the rules, it's about humanity." The whisper carried farther than intended, earning a sharp glance from the bailiff. Still, the sentiment lingered in the air. Unspoken but undeniable. The judge tapped his pen against the desk thoughtfully, considering both sides. On one hand, he knew the prosecutor was right. Laws existed to maintain order, and exceptions could lead to chaos. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the image of Eddie standing nervously at the witness stand, speaking with quiet dignity about survival and respect. And then there was Marcus, a decorated veteran who risked arrest not out of rebellion, but out of loyalty to a friend. These weren't criminals in the traditional sense. They were human beings caught in a system that often failed to see them as such. Finally, the judge sighed and removed his glasses, setting them down gently on the desk. He looked around the courtroom, taking in the sea of faces watching him intently. "This case," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "isn't just about trespassing or public ordinances. At its core, it's about values, about how we treat each other, about whether we choose to see the person behind the circumstance or turn a blind eye because it's easier." His statement sent ripples through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uncertain glances. The judge turned back to Marcus and Eddie, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Marcus," he said, "your actions demonstrate courage and conviction. They remind us that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's necessary. As for you, Mr. Eddie," he paused, studying the younger man's face, "you've shown remarkable resilience. Life hasn't been kind to you, but you haven't given up. That takes strength." Eddie blinked, surprised by the judge's words. No one had ever called him strong before, not since everything fell apart. He glanced at Marcus, who gave him an encouraging smile, and felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't worthless after all. The prosecutor cleared his throat again, eager to steer the conversation back to legalities. "Your Honor," he interjected, "while these sentiments are admirable, we must address the issue at hand. The defendant knowingly violated established regulations. Precedent dictates." "Precedent can be challenged," the judge interrupted, his tone firm but calm. "And sometimes challenging precedent is exactly what we need to do." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "Let me make one thing clear. I am not dismissing the importance of laws. They keep our society functioning. But laws are meant to serve people, not dehumanize them. If we enforce rules without compassion, without understanding the stories behind the faces, then we've lost sight of what truly matters." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, some cheering softly under their breath, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The prosecutor sat down heavily, realizing the battle was slipping away. Even the bailiff looked uneasy, unsure how to react to such an unconventional ruling. Meanwhile, Marcus and Eddie exchanged a glance, hope flickering in their eyes for the first time that day. After a moment, the judge raised a hand to quiet the room. When silence returned, he addressed Marcus directly. "Mr. Marcus, I find your intentions commendable. However, breaking the law, even for noble reasons, is still breaking the law. Therefore, I will impose a nominal fine. Consider it a reminder that actions have consequences." He paused, then added with a faint smile, "But rest assured, this incident will not appear on your record." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Marcus nodded gratefully, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said sincerely. Then, Turning to Eddie, he placed a reassuring hand on his friend's shoulder. The worst was over, or so they thought. The judge wasn't finished yet. Picking up his gavel, he looked toward the gallery where city officials sat observing the proceedings. "To the representatives of this city," he announced, his voice carrying authority, "I urge you to reconsider your policies regarding homelessness. Enforcing curfews and banning sleeping in public spaces may solve immediate concerns, but they fail to address the root causes. Compassion should guide our decisions, not convenience. Perhaps it's time to explore solutions that uplift rather than punish." With that, he brought the gavel down sharply, signaling the end of the trial. The sound echoed through the courtroom, followed by spontaneous applause from the audience. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, moved by the judge's wisdom and fairness. Marcus and Eddie stood side by side, overwhelmed by the support surrounding them. For years they'd felt like outsiders, but today they were heroes in their own small way. As the crowd began to disperse, reporters rushed forward, eager to capture the story. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust into their faces, and questions flew from every direction. Marcus handled the attention gracefully, using the opportunity to speak about the struggles faced by veterans and the homeless alike. Eddie, however, shrank back, overwhelmed by the sudden spotlight. Marcus noticed and stepped protectively in front of him, deflecting the barrage of inquiries until they could slip outside unnoticed. Once they were finally alone, standing on the courthouse steps beneath the bright afternoon sun, Eddie exhaled deeply. "I can't believe that happened," he muttered, running a hand through his messy hair. Marcus chuckled softly, patting him on the back. "Believe it, buddy," he said. "We made a difference today, maybe not a big one, but enough to start something." Little did they know their story was far from over. News outlets picked up the tale, sharing it across social media platforms and television networks. Within hours, messages of support poured in from strangers all over the country. Local organizations reached out, offering Eddie temporary housing and access to resources he'd never dreamed possible. For the first time in years, he dared to imagine a future beyond park benches and empty stomachs. For Marcus, the experience reinforced his belief in the power of standing up for what's right, even when it feels like the world is against you. Together, he and Eddie proved that sometimes all it takes is one brave act to inspire change. And as they walked away from the courthouse, side by side, they carried with them not only hope, but also the knowledge that they had sparked a conversation that would continue long after they were gone. As Marcus and Eddie stepped out of the courthouse, the noise of the city hit them like a wave. Cars honked in the distance, people hurried past with their heads down, and the smell of street food wafted through the air. It was life as usual outside, but inside the two men, something had shifted. They weren't just leaving a legal battle behind, they were walking away with a newfound sense of purpose. For the first time in what felt like forever, they felt seen. Not as problems to be solved or statistics to be ignored, but as human, beings worthy of respect. Eddie squinted against the sunlight, adjusting the borrowed jacket someone from the crowd had insisted he take. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly, glancing at Marcus. His voice carried a mix of gratitude and guilt, as if he still wasn't sure he deserved any of this. Marcus smiled, shaking his head. "You don't need to thank me, Eddie. We're friends, remember? Friends look out for each other." The simplicity of Marcus's words struck Eddie deeply. In all his years on the streets, no one had ever called him a friend. Not genuinely, anyway. Most people either avoided him altogether or tossed spare, change his way without making eye contact. But Marcus was different. He didn't see Eddie as a charity case or a lost cause. He saw him as a person, flaws and all. And that made all the difference. Before they could say anything else, a young woman approached them hesitantly. She held a notepad and pen in her hands, clearly nervous about interrupting. "Excuse me," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I'm a reporter with the local paper. I was wondering if I could ask you both a few questions." Her eyes darted between Marcus and Eddie, searching for permission. Marcus glanced at Eddie, who shrugged uncertainly. "It's up to you," Marcus said. "If you're not comfortable, we can walk away." Eddie thought for a moment, then nodded, slowly. Okay, he murmured. But don't make me sound like some kind of hero. I'm not. The reporter smiled warmly, sensing Eddie's discomfort. Don't worry, she assured him. I just want to tell your story the way it is. Honest and real. With that, she began asking questions, starting with Marcus. He spoke openly about his military service, the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life, and how meeting Eddie had reminded him of the importance of community. When it was Eddie's turn, he stumbled over his words at first, unsure how much to share. But as the conversation went on, he found himself opening up, talking about the hardships he'd faced and the loneliness that came with living on the streets. By the time the interview ended, a small crowd had gathered around them. Strangers stopped to listen, nodding along or wiping away tears. One man handed Eddie a $20 bill, saying simply, "For whatever you need." A woman pressed a warm sandwich into his hands, insisting he eat it before it got cold. Others offered hugs or words of encouragement, telling him he wasn't alone. Eddie stood there, overwhelmed by the kindness pouring in from every direction. It was so unexpected, so foreign, that he didn't know how to react. All he could do was mumble thank yous, his voice trembling with emotion. Marcus watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because Eddie was finally getting the recognition he deserved. Sadness because it shouldn't have taken a courtroom drama for people to notice him. Still, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The attention they'd received wasn't going to fade anytime soon. If anything, it would grow. Already, reporters from bigger outlets were calling, eager to cover their story. Social media posts about their trial had gone viral, sparking debates about homelessness, compassion, and justice. Some praised Marcus and Eddie as symbols of hope. Others criticized them, arguing that breaking the law was never justified. But amidst the noise, one thing was clear. Their actions had ignited a conversation that couldn't be ignored. Later that evening, after the chaos had died down, Marcus and Eddie found themselves sitting on a park bench, the same one where they'd first met months earlier. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass. Neither of them spoke for a while, content to simply sit in silence and watch the world go by. Finally, Eddie broke the quiet. "Do you think things will actually change?" he asked, his tone hesitant. "Or are people just going to forget about us once the news cycle moves on?" Marcus sighed, leaning back against the bench. "I don't know, buddy," he admitted. "Some people will probably move on, yeah, but others won't. There are always folks who care enough to keep pushing for change, even when it's hard. And hey, maybe this whole thing will inspire someone to do more than just talk about helping. Maybe it'll make them act." Eddie nodded thoughtfully, chewing on the last bite of the sandwich he'd been given earlier. "I guess that's something," he said softly. Then, after a pause, he added, "What about you? You okay with all this attention? Feels kind of weird, doesn't it?" Marcus chuckled, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Yeah, it does feel weird," he admitted. "I didn't do any of this for fame or recognition. I just wanted to stand up for what's right. But if telling our story helps even one person understand what it's like to be in your shoes or mine, then I guess it's worth it." Their conversation drifted off as night fell, wrapping the park in darkness. Streetlights flickered on, casting pools of golden light onto the pathways. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the faint hum of traffic filled the air. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions they'd experienced earlier. For the first time in a long while, both men felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to wake up. Over the next few days, the impact of their story continued to spread. Local organizations reached out, offering Eddie temporary housing and access to job training programs. At first, he resisted, afraid of getting his hopes up only to have them crushed again. But Marcus encouraged him to take the leap, reminding him that sometimes taking a chance was the bravest thing a person could do. Slowly, Eddie began to trust, not just in the offers being made, but in himself. Meanwhile, Marcus became an unofficial, spokesperson for veterans' rights and homelessness awareness. He attended community meetings, gave interviews, and worked with advocacy groups to push for policy changes. Though he never sought the spotlight, he embraced it as a tool to amplify voices that often went unheard. Together, he and Eddie proved that even in a world quick to judge, moments of humanity could shine through. One evening, as they sat together in Eddie's new apartment, a modest but clean space provided by a non-profit, Marcus raised a cup of coffee and a mock toast. "To new beginnings," he said with a grin. Eddie laughed, raising his own mug. "And old friends," he added. As they clinked their cups together, the weight of everything they'd been through seemed to lift, if only for a moment. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain: they'd face it side by side. Eddie's new apartment wasn't much, but to him it felt like a palace. The walls were bare except for a small calendar someone had pinned up near the door. A single bed sat in the corner, neatly made with fresh sheets and a thin blanket. There was a tiny kitchenette with a stove that sputtered when turned on, and a bathroom so clean it almost sparkled. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, a place where he could close the door and feel safe for the first time in years. At first, Eddie struggled to adjust. Every creak of the floorboards or knock at the door sent his heart racing, convinced someone would come to take it all away. He'd spent so long living without stability that having even a little felt surreal. Marcus noticed his unease during their visits and tried to reassure him. "You earned this, Eddie," he'd say firmly. "No one's going to take it from you. This is your chance to start over." But starting over wasn't easy. Eddie had to relearn how to live indoors, how to use appliances, manage bills, and stick to a routine. Simple tasks like grocery shopping overwhelmed him at first. Supermarkets were loud and crowded, and the sheer variety of choices paralyzed him. Should he buy rice or pasta, milk or juice? Each decision felt monumental, as if getting it wrong might ruin everything. Marcus saw the frustration building in his friend and offered to help. Together they went shopping, filling the cart with essentials while Marcus patiently explained things like unit prices and expiration dates. Beyond practical skills, Eddie also had to confront deeper fears of failure, rejection, and trust. For years, survival on the streets had taught him to rely only on himself. Letting others in, accepting help, felt unnatural. But Marcus refused to give up on him. He visited regularly, bringing food or just sitting quietly in the apartment while Eddie worked through his emotions. Sometimes they talked, other times they didn't need to. Their friendship became a lifeline, grounding Eddie when self-doubt threatened to pull him under. Meanwhile, Marcus threw himself into advocacy work, driven by the response to their story. Local leaders invited him to speak at town hall meetings about homelessness and veteran support. Schools asked him to share his experiences with students, hoping to inspire empathy and understanding. At first, Marcus hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, and he worried people wouldn't listen. But every time he stood in front of a crowd, he saw faces lighting up with curiosity and compassion. That kept him going. One day, after a particularly moving speech at a community center, a young woman approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. She introduced herself as Sarah, a social worker who specialized in helping homeless families. "Your words really hit home for me," she said softly. "I've been doing this job for years, but hearing your story reminded me why I started in the first place." Marcus smiled, shaking her hand. "It's not my story alone," he replied. "It belongs to everyone who's ever been overlooked or dismissed, people like Eddie." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, then asked if she could meet Eddie. She wanted to hear his perspective firsthand, believing it could strengthen her own efforts. Marcus agreed, arranging a meeting between them later that week. When Sarah arrived at Eddie's apartment, she brought along a folder filled with resources, programs for job training, mental health counseling, and financial assistance. Eddie flipped through the pages nervously, unsure what to make of it all. This is for me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Sarah said gently, "and none of it is charity. You're working hard to rebuild your life, and these are tools to help you succeed. But remember, progress takes time. Don't rush yourself. Her kindness broke through Eddie's defenses, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe he might actually have a future worth fighting for. As weeks turned into months, both men began to settle into their new rhythms. Eddie attended weekly sessions with a counselor recommended by Sarah, slowly unpacking the trauma of his past. He joined a vocational program aimed at teaching marketable skills, excelling in woodworking despite initial struggles. His instructors praised his determination, saying he had a natural talent for crafting intricate designs. For Eddie, creating something beautiful out of raw materials felt symbolic, a way of reclaiming control over his life. Marcus, too, found fulfillment in his role as an advocate. Though he still wrestled with personal challenges, sleepless nights haunted by memories of war, financial strain from living paycheck to paycheck, he discovered purpose in giving back. He collaborated with nonprofits to organize outreach events, handing out supplies and connecting individuals with services. Whenever skeptics questioned whether such efforts truly made a difference, Marcus pointed to Eddie as proof. Change doesn't happen overnight, he'd tell them, but it starts with caring enough to try. Their bond deepened as well. While Eddie grew more independent, he never forgot the man who'd stood by him when no one else would. On weekends, they often met at the park where their friendship began, sharing meals or simply enjoying the quiet. Those moments reminded them of how far they'd come, and how much farther they could go together. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled around their feet, Eddie stopped mid-conversation and looked at Marcus seriously. "I owe you everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus shook his head immediately. "No, you don't," he replied. "You did the hard part. You kept going when most people would have given up. All I did was remind you that you weren't alone." Eddie smiled faintly, blinking back tears. "Still," he said, "thank you for seeing me when no one else did." Marcus clapped him on the shoulder, grinning. "Always, buddy, always." By winter, Eddie had completed his training program and secured a part-time job at a local carpentry shop. His first paycheck was modest, but it represented more than money. It symbolized hope. On Christmas Eve, he surprised Marcus with a handmade gift, a small wooden box engraved with the words, "For my friend." Inside, Marcus found a note scribbled in Eddie's messy handwriting. "Thank you for showing me I'm more than what I see in the mirror. Merry Christmas." Touched beyond words, Marcus hugged Eddie tightly, promising to treasure the gift forever. That night, as snowflakes drifted lazily outside his window, Marcus realized something profound. Their journey hadn't just changed Eddie's life, it had changed his, too. By standing up for someone society deemed invisible, he'd rediscovered his own sense of purpose. And in doing so, he'd proven that even in a world full of darkness, acts of courage and kindness could light the way forward. The story of Marcus and Eddie didn't end there. In fact, it was only the beginning. As spring approached, plans were underway to expand the outreach programs Marcus championed, inspired by the success of their partnership. Word spread about their unlikely friendship, drawing attention from national media outlets eager to highlight stories of resilience and redemption. Yet neither man sought fame or recognition. What mattered most to them was the impact they could create, one person, one act of compassion at a time. In the end, their tale served as a reminder that change doesn't require grand gestures or flawless heroes. Sometimes all it takes is two people willing to stand together against the tide, proving that even in the face of adversity, humanity prevails. As the months rolled by, Marcus and Eddie's story continued to spread far beyond their small city. News outlets across the country picked up on their journey, framing it as a testament to friendship, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. Social media buzzed with posts about them. Photos of Eddie's handmade wooden box went viral, accompanied by captions like, "This is what kindness looks like," or "Proof that everyone deserves a second chance." People who had never met either man felt inspired to act, whether by volunteering at shelters, donating to local charities, or simply taking the time to talk to someone they might otherwise have ignored. For Eddie, the attention was overwhelming, but transformative. He began attending community events, often invited by organizations eager to share his story. At first, he struggled with public speaking, his voice trembling as he stood in front of crowds. But over time, he grew more confident, learning to articulate the pain and hope that defined his life. His speeches were raw and honest, free of polished rhetoric, but full of emotion. "I used to think I didn't matter," he'd say, his hands gripping the podium tightly. "But then I met Marcus and he showed me I do. And now I want to show others the same thing." His words resonated deeply, especially with those who had faced similar hardships. After one event, a young woman approached, him in tears, thanking him for giving her the courage to seek help after years of battling addiction and homelessness. Another man handed him a business card, offering mentorship and job opportunities within his company. These moments reminded Eddie that his story wasn't just about survival, it was about connection. By sharing his truth, he was helping others find theirs. Marcus, too, embraced his role as an advocate, though he remained humble about it. When reporters asked how he wanted to be remembered, he shrugged and said simply, "As someone who tried to make a difference." For him, the real reward wasn't fame or recognition, it was seeing tangible change unfold. The city council revisited its policies regarding homelessness, implementing new programs aimed at providing temporary housing and employment support. Local businesses partnered with nonprofits to create job training initiatives, many of which directly benefited individuals like Eddie. Even the park where their journey began saw improvements, with benches upgraded and security guards trained to approach people with compassion rather than hostility. Despite these victories, both men understood that systemic issues couldn't be solved overnight. There were still nights when Eddie woke up anxious, worried that everything could slip away. And there were days when Marcus felt frustrated, knowing that countless others remained unseen and unheard. Yet they refused to let setbacks diminish their progress. Instead, they focused on what they could control, showing up, speaking out, and supporting each other through thick and thin. One summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus and Eddie returned to the courthouse steps where their lives had changed forever. It had become something of a tradition for them, a way of grounding themselves amidst the whirlwind of attention and change. They sat side by side, sipping coffee from paper cups as the city bustled around them. Neither spoke for a long while, content to soak in the moment. Finally, Eddie broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in that night?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "All the time," he admitted. "But I try not to dwell on what-ifs. What matters is what we've done since then, and what we'll keep doing." Eddie nodded slowly, staring out at the sea of faces passing by. Some glanced curiously at the two men sitting on the steps, others hurried past without noticing. "You know," he said after a pause, "people always ask me what I learned from all this, like there's some big lesson I can sum up in a sentence." He turned to Marcus, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "But the truth is, I'm still learning. Every day feels like a new chapter." Marcus grinned, clapping him lightly on the back. "That's the best answer you could give," he said. "Life doesn't come with neat endings or easy answers. All we can do is keep moving forward, one step at a time." Their conversation drifted off as twilight settled over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Streetlights flickered on, casting soft glows onto the pavement. Somewhere nearby, a street musician played a soulful tune on his guitar, drawing applause from passers-by. The world moved on, as it always did. But for Marcus and Eddie, this moment felt timeless. In the weeks that followed, their efforts expanded even further. Eddie joined a peer support group for formerly homeless individuals, sharing his experiences and offering guidance to those navigating similar challenges. He also started teaching woodworking classes at a community center, passing on the skills he'd learned during his vocational training. Watching his students' eyes light up as they crafted their first pieces filled him with pride, not just in himself, but in the ripple effect of positivity spreading outward. Marcus, meanwhile, collaborated with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at addressing root causes of homelessness, such as affordable housing shortages and mental health care gaps. Though the process was slow and fraught with obstacles, he remained optimistic. Change takes patience, he often reminded himself, and anyone willing to listen. But every little bit counts. By fall, their combined impact had grown significantly. Local schools incorporated their story into curriculums, using it as a case study for empathy and civic responsibility. Community art projects sprang up around the city, featuring murals depicting themes of unity and compassion. One mural, painted near the park where they'd first met, showed two silhouettes walking side by side beneath a starry sky. Beneath it, bold letters spelled out a simple message: "Together we rise." On the anniversary of their trial, Marcus and Eddie organized a gathering at the park to celebrate how far they'd come. Friends, supporters, and strangers alike joined them, bringing food, music, and laughter. Children ran around playing tag while adults chatted animatedly about ways to continue making a difference. It was a joyful occasion brimming with hope and gratitude. As the evening drew to a close, Marcus stood up to address the crowd. "A year ago, none of us could have imagined where we'd be today," he began, his voice steady yet warm. "But here we are, stronger, kinder, and more united than ever. This isn't just my story or Eddie's story. It's our story, a reminder that when we choose to see each other, not as problems but as people, we can create something beautiful." The crowd erupted into applause, cheering loudly. Eddie joined Marcus at the front, raising a hand to quiet them down. "And, hey," he added with a grin, "if two guys like us can make a difference, imagine what the rest of you can do." Laughter rippled through the audience, followed by cheers of agreement. As fireworks lit up the night sky, Marcus and Eddie stood, shoulder to shoulder, watching the colorful bursts reflect off the faces of those gathered around them. They knew their work wasn't finished. The road ahead would still be challenging, but they faced it with unwavering determination. Together, they had proven that even in a world quick to judge, acts of courage and compassion could spark lasting change. And so, their story continued, not as a tale of triumph over adversity, but as a living example of what happens when humanity shines through. One friendship, one act of kindness, one moment of understanding at a time.